Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series, I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager or both. Hi, and welcome to this week's podcast, which is around resilience. We're still in the middle of COVID-19, and I think quite a lot of people have had to face how resilient they seem to be or are during this difficult and challenging period. So I thought I'd just run through my top 10 tips for being resilient, which might be particularly appropriate or useful in the current situation. So just a general point is that 90% of resilience, according to research, really comes from within us. It's not external to us. It's not about where we are and the environment generally. It's mainly about our internal state and the way in which we marshal our own inner strengths and reserves and our mental capacities to deal with whatever's thrown at us. And those of you who know me quite well will know that one of my key models that help me in life generally is the provocation response model, which is that whatever happens to us that we'd rather didn't, whatever provocation we have to face, it's the quality of our response to that provocation that tends to make the difference. So two people facing an identical provocation will have different responses, and it's the response that people have that make the difference. So most of today, if not all of today's talk, will be about our internal responses to whatever we're facing. So, with that in mind, let's get on with the top 10 on resilience. The first one is a kind of gentle reminder that it's okay to wallow, but not permanently. So only wallow for a while. That's tip number one. By that I mean sometimes things just do get on top of us a bit, and we just need to take a break, step back and, dive under the duvet. But not for life and not for long. So, yes, give yourself a break. Feel a little bit indulgent. Take some time out. Treat yourself. Disappear even for a while, but only for a while. Don't make it a permanent state. So tip number one, wallow, but only for a while. And tip number two, very much about letting things go. I use a model, again, people will know this, it's called 3-2-1, and you organise your life and everything that faces you into one of three categories. If it's a 1, it means it's down to you to sort that out. There's nobody else, it's you or you alone that will be responsible for what happens. So that's a 1. A 2 is something you don't actually own or control, but you could influence. But you have to make a decision about whether it's worth the effort that will be involved in trying to create the positive influence. So a 2 is anything that you could influence, but you'll have to make a decision as to whether it's worth it. And anything that's a 3 is completely and utterly beyond your control and even your influence. So if it's a 1, you take ownership of it and you prioritise all your 1s into some kind of order. Just do it in priority order. Tip number 2 is decide whether you are going to do something or not, and if you are going to try and influence it, then move it to a 1 and put some influence game plan together. And if you're not going to influence it, move it to a 3. Let it go, because that's what you do with number 3s. You have to let them go. Now that's an easier thing to say than to do for many, many people. Letting go is a real skill that takes time and effort to develop. But here's the point. If there is absolutely nothing you can do about it, then not letting it go has some serious downsides. The first one is it's preoccupying you, which probably means that you worry about it even though you can't do anything about it. So it's a bit of an unproductive emotional state to worry without being able to do. And secondly, of course, it occupies you and therefore prevents you from getting on with things that you can do. So worrying is not a productive or action-centered strategy. It takes you down, it may take down the other people who are close to you, and in fact, it stops you getting on with things that you can do. So please look at things that are beyond your control or influence and learn to let them go. Got a nice little story about that, and that is about monkeys being trapped in India. Now in India, apparently, if you try and catch a monkey, you build a little perspex cage sunk into the ground with a little hole, and inside the cage you put bananas. Apparently monkeys go mad for bananas. So the hole's big enough for the monkey to put their hand in and reach out and get the banana. But of course, when they try and get the banana back out, they can't, because the fist now holding the banana is too big to come back out through the hole. But rather than let go of something they desire, something they're hanging on to, they remain trapped and are easily caught. So it's a kind of little metaphor for all of us. Do we hang on to things that really we should let go of? Because it will set us free. And that leads on to tip number 3, forgiveness. It's a really powerful concept, this. Many of us in life will have been hurt, will have been upset, will have been let down. And a natural reaction is to resent that, to carry that hurt with you. But in fact, the only person who's really suffering with that hurt is you. If you can learn to just let it go, to forgive, to move on, you absolutely will be healthier and more resilient. So, tip number 3, forgive. If you don't let go and forgive, the only one suffering will be you. Tip number 4 is keep your reservoir topped up. What I mean by that is that we all have a stock of assets, mental, physical, emotional, and they can, just like water in a reservoir, deplete because they're all being used up far more than they're being replenished. So in order for a reservoir to work, the outgoing has to be topped up with the incoming. So how's your reservoir balance? Are you spending more than you're topping up? So there's 2 things there. One is be careful about how much of your emotional, physical and mental reservoir you spend, and think also about what you are actually doing to keep that topped up. What do you do to build and sustain your emotional, physical and mental strengths? So be careful not to get depleted in your personal reservoir. Keep your reservoir topped up. And that really leads to tip number 5, because in order to do that, 3 things are absolutely crucial. Eat well, sleep well, and exercise well. It should be everybody's daily mantra. What really matters is your well-being, your overall health. So find strategies that help you build that. And they usually revolve around how well you sleep, which is not only how long you sleep, but the quality of your sleep, how well you eat, and how well you exercise. And that doesn't mean to say you have to be a gym bunny. You know, I do a walk every day. I don't go anywhere near a gym. The main thing, I think, is about moving, about keeping your body active. So, I don't know, go dancing. Dance around the kitchen when you're making a meal or just before you sit down to eat. Just go for a walk to the park. Just move. Don't become too much of a couch potato. So, tip number 5, eat well, sleep well, and exercise well, mainly around movement. Tip number 6, count your blessings. I'm a huge fan of this. You know, I wake up and think usually somewhere during the day, I really am lucky. You know, the life I have, the friends I have, the family I have, the life I have is in many ways, in global terms, exceptional. You know, there are so many other people, thousands, millions, billions of people, far, far, far worse off than me. So really, what have I got to grumble about? You know, I've got my health, I've got my well-being, I'm a happy bunny. Why wouldn't I be with so much on my side? So let's not get things out of proportion. Keep a sense of perspective. And I think it's just useful every morning to wake up and think, you know, I'm lucky to be who I am, where I am, with who I'm with. So tip number 6, count your blessings. Tip number 7 is move through life with a positive mindset. And what I think I mean by that practically is, in any given situation, see and look for the positives in it. Somebody said to me the other day, haven't we had a lot of rain recently? And I said, yes, but isn't everything green? Rain can be seen as a negative. Sure, people get wet and it looks cold and miserable. But, the land is being nourished. It's why we have such lush pasture land in this green and pleasant land. Look for the positives in things. If I have to face a difficulty, then I'll tend to frame it as a challenge. Let's see how I do. Can I manage this as well as I can? So it's about mindset, isn't it? It's about you're in a situation. It's back to that provocation response. And my response is nearly always to see the best in the situation, the best in someone. If somebody is giving me a hard time, and I'm not suggesting they do, but if somebody is, then I think, well, it may not be intentional. They may not even know or intend themselves to be doing that. Or, there but for the grace, it might be I would be in a similar situation as them and therefore giving somebody else a hard time. It may just be their stress release. I shouldn't take it personally. I just happen to be the person who's in the firing line. And you know what? If they are giving me a hard time, I'm quite a good choice because I won't overreact. So just take a view of life that's more positive than negative, and you will be healthier as a consequence. Tip number 8. This is a kind of 3-point tip. You're asking yourself 3 questions as you face something that might be taking you down or causing a concern or a worry. And here are the 3 points. 1. What's the worst that could happen? 2. How likely is it to happen? And 3. Then what? What will I do if the worst happens? And there's 2 things about that. One is it really gives you a sense of perspective. What's the worst that can happen? Well, that might happen. Okay. But how likely is it? Okay. And even if what's potentially going to happen and unlikely nonetheless does happen, what would I do about it? Because I still have to have some kind of reaction if the worst comes to the worst. So some people have a real struggle with thinking through the possibilities of difficulty. As soon as they see something, they'll frame it to be going to be bad. The outcome will almost be bad. So get more of a sense of perspective by asking the 3 questions. What's the worst that can happen? How likely is it? And then what? When I set up my own business 30 years ago, that was very much part of my approach. I thought, well, I'm going to set up my own business now. I'm going to leave the stability of a full-time job that's well paid and that I quite enjoy, and I'm going to launch out on my own. What's the worst that can happen? Well, clearly I could go bankrupt. I could go bust. 2, how likely is it? Well, at the time I went solo, it was one of the recession periods, and there was a 50% chance I would go bust. So the worst that could happen would be I'd go bust. There's a 50-50 chance I might go bust. The 3rd question, and then what if that happens, was the clincher for me. Well, I wouldn't die. I would just have to find another job, and at least I'd know. I'd given it my best shot. One of the things that always bugged me at that time was I didn't want to be, in 10 years' time, thinking back, wondering what might have happened. I wanted to know. So I had to go. 30 years on, I'm still alive and kicking, and I think it probably was the best decision I ever made in my life. So don't assume the worst. And that leads to tip number 9. Avoid catastrophizing. It's a big word and it's a funny word really, but it's stop seeing the worst in everything. That some people have a frame where if there's uncertainty, it's bound to go wrong. It's bound to be bad. It's never going to work. I always tell this little story about my mum, bless her. She's only quite tiny and a little bit nervous in some areas, and she decided she wasn't going to learn how to drive. And when I asked why, she said, well, I might have an accident and kill myself or kill somebody else. I said, okay, so how are you going to get around? And she said, well, I'll just go by public transport. And I said, well, then what if you're in a vehicle? Oh, she said, yeah, of course, they can crash as well, can't they? So I'll just be a pedestrian. I said, well, what can happen to pedestrians? She said, yeah, of course, pedestrians can be knocked down. I tell you what, I'll just stay in my house. 2 up, 2 down. I said, well, do accidents ever happen? Oh, she said, yes, I heard the other day about somebody falling down the stairs, breaking their neck. And I said, so what are you going to do? And she just looked at me and smiled and said, it's ridiculous, isn't it? I said, yeah, it is ridiculous. Life is actually risky. Something untoward and unhelpful and really sad happens to somebody somewhere every day. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't live our life as fully as we can. So tip number 9, avoid catastrophizing. And tip number 10, this is a particular technique of mine to finish with, and it's called convert worry into problem solving. And it's a 3-step approach. So here we go. The first step is to recognize when you're worrying. Now for me, my stomach churns. Other people get tight shoulders or neck ache or sweaty palms or palpitations, whatever. There's usually some physiological sign that you're worrying. So learn to recognize when you are starting to worry. And as you do, create what we call a program interrupt. Something that's going to stop you in your tracks. I have a mental image of a flashing red neon sign that simply says stop. Stop, stop, stop. And it slows down. Stop, 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 stop. I can see it now as I'm talking with you. So I've now associated the churn in my stomach with this flashing neon sign. That's the second step, to create what we call a program interrupt. It interrupts the worry program. It stops you in your tracks. And then the third step is to move into a 5-step problem-solving thinking frame. And here are the 5 steps. What's the problem? Why is it a problem? What are my options? Which of those do I prefer? Do it. That's it. Step 1, what's the problem? Step 2, why is it a problem? Step 3, what are my options? Step 4, which of those options works best for me? Step 5, well, do it. And here's the key point, that whilst I am working my way through those 5 steps, all of which will make me think about my answers, I don't have the space to worry. The mind cannot equally pay attention to 2 separate thought processes. So either the worry will beat the problem solving, or the problem solving will beat the worry. For example, suppose you're a fan of a particular, TV series, Coronation Street or EastEnders, say that, and it's on tonight, and you're looking forward to seeing it. But as you go home, you've got a particular worry. Now, one of 2 things are going to happen. You'll either watch that program, let's say Coronation Street, and for half an hour, you'll forget your worry as you get absorbed in Coronation Street. Or you'll find that you can't this week concentrate on Coronation Street because you're too preoccupied with your worry. You may even forget that it's on. So one thought process will beat the other. So if you can learn the problem-solving process, the 5 steps, it will deflect and distract you from worry. And of course, instead of worrying, you've had a go at solving the problem. Much, much more constructive. Worry, as I said earlier, is counterproductive. Problem solving is entirely productive. So that's tip number 10. Convert worry into problem solving. So that's it. Those are my top 10 tips to help you become more resilient. Just to quickly run through them again. First one is letting go. Use the 3-2-1 technique. The second one is forgiveness. If you don't let go and forgive, the only one suffering is you. Tip number 3 is keeping your reservoir topped up. Tip number 4 is eat well, sleep well, and exercise and move well. Tip number 5, count your blessings. Tip number 6, look for the positives. Tip number 7, what's the worst? How likely is that to happen? And then what? Tip number 8 is avoid catastrophizing. Tip number 9 is converting worry into problem solving. And I've ended with tip number 10, which I started with, which is to remember that most of the resilience comes from within. Don't look to the outside world to make you resilient. You have to make yourself resilient. And a good way of doing that is to follow those tips. So I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for listening, and bye for now. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.